environment research.
Okay. Hello.
No.
My students know I never prepare anything. I actually did tonight, so we are recording. Good evening. My name is James McNicholas, and I'm an adjunct faculty member here at the College of Southern Maryland. Before I begin, I'd like to say a very special thank you to Bernice Brazina for making this happen this evening. So a round of applause to Bernice. We are recording. We are live.
So she's definitely here.
Yes. Tonight's special guest lecture on business ethics featuring Mr. Steve Luginbill. Mr. Luginbill's, am I pronouncing that right?
Luginbill.
Luginbill?
It's good. It's good.
Mr. Luginbill has joined us this evening to share his experiences and insights into the world of corporate ethics. Mr. Luginbill has over 30 years of corporate experience and has held senior level positions at corporations such as Enron, MCI WorldCom, and Sprint. In addition, Mr. Luginbill has experience with startup companies in both the telecommunications and the alternative energy sectors. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the podium Mr. Steve Luginbill.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk. And when I saw it was cyber ethics, I thought that is an extremely relevant topic for this time period. But it also is relevant to, obviously, telecommunications throughout the past. One of the things that really got me thinking about the cyber ethics, and I think might even be a parallel to what I might get into, what I will get into, is that this, like the Snowden case, legal, illegal, ethical, not ethical. In his mind, it's ethical. He's revealing information that he thought the public should have. Is it legal? No. Is it ethical in our minds? Probably not. But in his mind, it was ethical, and he's doing something to help society. When we get into the Enron situation, I'm going to concentrate mostly on, I'll give you a little background as we go through this, but I'm going to concentrate mostly on Enron and was it ethical as to what they did with what we call mark-to-market. And mark-to-market is an accounting, is a way of doing accounting, and it was a very aggressive posturing that they did, and then you can maybe see how potentially did they do what Snowden maybe thought he did. So the question is was Enron corrupt? Were they arrogant? Actually, they were both. I worked there for a little more than a year. My background has been in telecommunications. Started out with a master's in psychology, rehabilitation psychology. Went into the Computer Sciences Corporation, sold one of the first, basically it was a dual processor. To you folks, that's pretty common stuff now, but back then it was one of the first dual processors ever developed. I sold to the telecommunications group within the Pentagon, and then went on from there. I went into a company called UUNet, Telenet, then UUNet, and what we did, and we bought UUNet, and what I did for Telenet and then DataNet under UUNet, this is kind of complicated, but I ran the telecommunication side for the internet companies. So I saw how the internet was beginning to grow very, very rapidly. As a matter of fact, the individual I worked for, his name was Scott Yeager. He was one, you hear about who invented and made the internet commercial. Well, actually, it was an individual I worked for and an individual who started the company UUNet. His name was Rick Adams, and he was a very, very intelligent individual with no business savvy at all. And they came together at the time. The internet companies that were out there were primarily based on the idea of traversing multiple networks to get to where you wanted to go. So if you wanted to get to the West Coast, you had to go through 3 or 4 internets. It was a educational military setup, and it wasn't meant for commercialization. What he came up with Scott was the idea of a hub. And that hub became known as May East. May East was, and that became my organization that ran May East. As a matter of fact, it was just above my head. above my office, and it was a hub where all the major players, and most of the major players were in Washington, D.C. And so the major players all connected together and through this one hub. So instead of passing it through network, they just passed it through a hub. And so immediately the speed of the internet rapidly increased, and the commercialization started taking place after that. Now, actually, an individual who works for me went to a company that they called Equinix, and Equinix became a total building, and now they have multiple buildings where data passes through. And now people will go into those buildings, put their servers in there, and just pass data very rapidly. So where I'm coming from with this is that what happened is bandwidth has always been an issue. The bandwidth was key. As a matter of fact, when I worked for WorldCom and I ran the internet side of it, I got to the point where I started seeing some very odd things happening. Now, I did in fact interface with the top guys. I wasn't on the board. I wasn't necessarily in the decision process, but I was the vice president of national operations, so national sales and marketing. So I was involved in kind of the day-to-day type of things. And I saw a lot of internet companies, .com companies, buying bandwidth and then canceling orders probably 2 or 3 months later. What they would do, they'd order from multiple companies, and then when they got the bandwidth they needed, if it was first, they canceled all the other orders. But these orders started jacking up it looked like they started jacking up the potential for telecommunication companies. And so that was one of the issues. The other thing was Bernie Evers was doing some bad things as far as financial, basically bookkeeping. He was taking the interconnect. What interconnect is when you connect with another company, much like I talked about with the hub. If you interconnect with another company, then you actually get charged to interconnect. And what he was doing is he was taking that instead of as a cost, he was taking it more as an asset. And that was on the books, therefore he was inflating the revenue stream of WorldCom. And eventually the individual who ran UUNet, not Rick Adams, but the person who replaced him, was a very savvy business individual. And his name was John Sidgmore. And John took over WorldCom. He was very ethical, but he couldn't save WorldCom. And by that time, they had purchased. They basically have a leveraged buyout of MCI. And when they did that, one of the things that's kind of a side note I saw was, and I went through a number of mergers and acquisitions. A couple things happened during merger and acquisition, but when they did that, they put two totally different cultures together. And those two different cultures, one, MCI was, I like to say, like very business oriented. I was WorldCom and very IBM-ish, and whereas Bernie Evers was cowboy boots and gunslinger type of mentality. And it didn't work. And it was an immense failure. Not only was Bernie doing some bad things with the books, they tried to jam the two cultures together, leverage the ability and the infrastructure of each to increase revenue and decrease the expenditures. Well, the problem you have with that also is that, and you're going to see this as you go into the world, one of the things that you're going to face in almost now more than anything, small company, big company, or whatever type of organization, you're going to go through a merger and acquisition. And there is going to be, I can't even count how many I went through. The first one I went through with Telenet, I thought, these guys are really messing up. I should be taking notes. I didn't realize that I'd probably go through about 15 more. The last one was, well, actually we did some with Enron, but the last big one was MCI and WorldCom. And what happens is the people that work in the company, in the trenches, do the sales, do the technical, do the background, back office types of things, they start worrying. And they start getting very concerned about their jobs. And so instead of actually producing and going out and trying to make things happen, they're sitting around drinking coffee, worried about whether or not, oh, I heard they're getting fired, I heard they're getting fired. And so the productivity drops. So corporations, they very rarely thought about the employee from that ethical perspective and from that practical perspective. They just weren't thinking, they were thinking about bottom line revenue and, you know, how do we produce more revenue with less cost? And that is, in fact, obviously the driving factor within any corporation. Now, how do they get there is pretty much the ethical question. You know, do they get there through practical matters? Do they get there through basically pushing the envelope, which in fact happened with Enron. Enron, what I need to do is I'll give you a little bit of an idea of, let me see if I want to follow my notes somewhat, but not too much. Enron, I came from, when I was with the telecom industry, I got a kind of a, they call it a brick and block kind of mentality. What that means, you had to have a product, you had to sell a product, and you built on that product. It was a tangible asset. Well, what Enron did was they didn't have that mentality. What they did is they wanted you to create things. They were arrogant. They wanted me to move to Houston, Texas, and I said I wasn't going to move. So we were going to set up a headquarters up here, but things started spinning in a different direction. So I had a national organization where I would fly down to Houston on Monday morning, and they'd put me first class, fly down, pick me up in a limousine, and I'd attend Monday morning meetings. And then I'd stay there the week, and then I'd fly back on Friday. But during that period of time, they started saying, okay, we want you to run an international side. We want you to go international. And I said, no, I'm not going international. I'm not going to do that. And then I had offices in Oregon and other different places. And so the people in Oregon, they decided, okay, if you're not going to do international, we'll have somebody else do that. And I said, fine. And so it turns out I had a lot of people in Oregon, and they said, well, we want to go international. I said, no, you don't want to go international. You don't want to move. You're with a new company, a new technology in an older company. In other words, the telecommunication was a new division, a new trading division within Enron. They already traded, and they just started, by the way, online trading back then, and that was revolutionary. So online trading for gas and for power, but they were going to start trading telecommunications. They didn't know what they were doing. So as things progressed, they ended up, recruiting a lot of the people who reported to me and had them move over to Europe. Well, there's a lot of different things that happen. A lot of politics go on. But the one thing I do is I try to shoot straight with these guys. I said, look, you don't want to move. It's too new. I don't think they've got it. And you're putting yourself out there on a limb. No, Enron is smart. We're smarter than everybody else. Well, maybe you can be smart, but you aren't always wise. And long story short, on that side of it, I left Enron. I'll talk more about the culture of Enron, but I left Enron because they wanted me to move to Houston again. They kind of put a stake in the ground. You're going to move to Houston. I said, no, I'm not going to Houston. So we parted ways. But so the people in Oregon, they moved to Europe. Well, about a year after I left the company folded. It went under. I mean, because of what we're going to talk about and why. The people who moved, and I had some kind of ongoing issues with some people who reported to me and other people who were kind of, like I said, you're going to see it's very kind of I don't want to say volatile, but it's a kind of an environment where it just wasn't, people were stabbing people in the back and then telling them how nice they were and to their face. But so the company folded, and what they did is they left the people in Europe. Totally, just left them. Not a paycheck that came in, didn't move them back, said you're on your own, that's it. So the other thing you need to be careful of as you go into the, pick your targets very closely as you get into the business world and you start looking at technologies and you start looking at other companies that are saying we're going to have a rapid growth. If it's too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. Sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. So be careful. Yes, you can move. Yes, it's an opportunity. As you get older, get a little more wise about it. But in the beginning, you do need to be careful on how you select and what kind of company you're going to that has the idea that you're going to get paid a lot of money. Potentially, we can give you not as many anymore as it used to, options and that kind of thing. So Enron itself had the attitude that it would, you were judged by your peers and you were evaluated by your peers. Well, they also got one of the top 50 companies that, as far as who to work for. Well, I don't think whoever wrote those really understood what was going on with it. Because what would end up happening is people were somewhat, I guess, compensated for creative ideas. Well, those creative ideas a lot of times displaced everyday work that needed to happen. And so they were off basically chasing windmills and jousting with windmills and not really doing what they do. And on the other side of that, they were kissing up to their peers and to people who reported and they knew were gonna. And I did fine in the reviews, but I wouldn't go that direction. I saw the productivity. I saw people were more concerned. And so from an ethics perspective within the corporation, the way they evaluated each other was a problem. That's why you have management. Management is supposed to evaluate and understand their people. Can you get input? I definitely always sought input from my direct reports. But if I had 13 direct reports and they had, I don't know how many hundreds of people directing to them, those 13 people, they got 13 votes, I got 14. Because somebody has to be accountable and somebody has to step up and run the organization. You want to listen to those people who are working for you, but you can't let them run the company. And essentially, that's what's going on, was going on to some degree. And as time went on, to give you a little idea how I got to understand more and more about the culture of Enron, I was responsible for gathering, getting content, and signing agreements with, at the time they're called the regional Bell operating companies, the RBOCs. And these regional operating companies, what we would do is, the plan was to build a national network because they saw that telecommunications is taking off. So you build this national network, this backbone, this fiber backbone. It was going to be the fastest one out there. Because they always did it bigger, the biggest and the best. And then my responsibility was to have an organization develop content for that network, that we signed agreements with the RBOCs, and they have something called central offices, and that's where everybody basically comes to at one time and then hits a network. So in the central office, we were going to put servers, and on those servers, we were going to put content. And that was going to overcome the bandwidth problem initially, because everybody would get to it locally. The servers would give them what they wanted. We'd find out what information and what content they wanted most, and then that content was streamed to what we call the eyeballs, and the RBOCs had the eyeballs because they had basically everybody used the Bell operating companies. So we were on the corporate jet. We were flying around different places. And I was with Skilling and with Ken Lay. And we were sitting there and we were talking. And Ken Lay at the time, he turns to Jeff Skilling and he goes, Jeff, he says, this is almost the end of the quarter, by the way. How are we doing this quarter? And I thought to myself, here's the chairman of the board the guy who's on paper running the company, and he doesn't know how the company is doing near the end of the quarter. And to me, that said, whoa. And Jeff right away launched into, we're doing well here, we're doing well here, we're doing hell. Well here. So what I saw was Jeff Skilling was running that company. Ken Lay was in fact over here going out and flying around with me because he knew all the R, head of the all R box, and he was kind of a figurehead and a PR guy. So he really didn't have hands-on day-to-day knowledge of what was going on, and I think, now to get to it in the end, that was what was a big mistake. So the way that I'll use the telecommunications side. Enron did some corrupt things. Did Ken Lay know about them? Maybe he did. I'm not so sure. But Jeff Skilling definitely knew about him. And if you met the guy, and maybe it's my psychology background, but it's probably just anybody, you knew this guy was not a good guy right away. And he, a glad-handing type of individual. And he was definitely setting up corporations and offloading debt and bad business to these corporations that were owned by the company but were off the books. That was illegal. That was unethical. There's no doubt about it. And that's why he is in prison. But then you had the telecommunications side. Now the telecommunications side, getting back to the idea of Snowden's idea that he's doing something ethical because he's revealing information that should be public. Well, what you had with Enron is you had Arthur Andersen looking at their books. Arthur Andersen was one of the big 8 accounting firms back then. So they were telling them what you're doing is okay. And that is called mark-to-market accounting. Mark-to-market accounting, if you folks owned a small airline and you had a couple jets and you said, I'm going to buy another jet, but you had stockholders also, and they wanted to see that stock go up, as everybody during the dot-com period, if in fact you didn't highly exceed your revenue projections for the quarter, your stock would drop. It was just that simple. Not make, exceed, and highly usually, especially in the dot-com world. So now you have stockholders who are looking at you, and you own some jets. Okay, I convinced them I'm going to go out and buy another jet. What you said is you take a look at that jet and you said, okay, this has 200 seats in it. I can sell each seat for probably an average of $350, and I'm going to do that, fly that jet 3 different places a day times, something over a year, which turns out to be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. Well, instead of just booking the cost of the jet and what you were, what they did, what mark-to-market allows you to do is take that projection for 5 years to help drive up your stock, is why people do it, and take that as income on your books now. Now, that has some, now getting to the Enron situation, remember how I talked about the telecommunications problems that they had with the bandwidth. Bandwidth, everybody was jumping in, everybody needed bandwidth, everybody was ordering bandwidth. So they saw this and they said, okay, we're going to build that national background. What we're going to do with that national background is we're going to take that in and we're going to get these eyeballs and content, and then we're going to start trading bandwidth. They didn't know what they were talking about. Yeah, they brought us on, but like I said, I lasted about a year. And I told them, Skilling and Lay, in the plane, in the jet, I said, look, you do not have enough telecommunication people. You have too many MBAs. They looked at me like with daggers. And I thought, oh, well, that's a nice way to start things out. But what ends up happening is I was right. And you go back and you look at it, and they try to get too cute with accounting. And what they would do on the telecommunications side, remember, we didn't have a network. We didn't really have any revenue. So we'd go out and we'd buy what was called dark fiber. We would light it with wave division multiplexing, which means you're basically going to put light over it, and you're going to send data over the light waves over that, and you can send millions and millions and millions and millions of basically bytes of content doing that. What they said is, okay, if that dark fiber costs me $100,000, I'm going to subdivide that with multi-division wave multiplexing, and about a year to 2 years to 3 years to 5 years, it's going to be worth $50 million. That's what they took and put on the books, $50 million. So you're sitting there going, I'm like, this is like, I'm not an accountant, and Tommy is very good with that stuff, but I'm a kind of a business person, but I'm not an accounting person. I was always relied on people that smarter than myself to be able to do those type of things, but I knew that was a problem. So what ended up happening is, as they built this network out and they began to, things started going a little awry, and the networks were being built. The dot-com started failing, and bandwidth started going by the wayside. And now your accounting, you can't meet that goal that you were going to make, and all of a sudden you're in a hole. Just like you have that jet, and you project and take all that revenue. Well, you didn't fill it because all of a sudden there was a recession, and people aren't flying anymore. So all of a sudden, what you took and put on your books is no longer valid. As a matter of fact, now you have a deficit. And now your accounting, now you're looking at really bad shape. So now your stockholders' stock is not, at 93, it's at 33. So what drives ethically and legally, what drives a lot of business is the stockholders, the banks. As a matter of fact, a good friend of mine, he reported directly to Dell, and they were a stock-owned company. And every day he was head of accounting, and every day he was asked, how are we doing? Well, Dell bought the company back, and he used banks to help finance it. The banks were harder on him than the stockholders. So when you get in the position of a company that has stock, you're constantly your hand is held to the fire to meet those and exceed expectations. And that's where the ethical components come into play. Let's take, as a matter of fact, the CFO was Fastow, and he actually gave a quote. But if we take what they're talking about as far as mark to market, and you look at what that has done to the company, and you look where they're going, all of a sudden you realize that they're not going to make it. And what ended up happening, and the way I see it, and from my interaction with Jeff in Skilling and with Ken Lay, is Ken did not know what was going on. But I had an office next to a young lady at the time. Her name was Sharon Watkins. And I would be talking to Sharon Watkins, and I'd say, Sharon, I said, this is kind of where I'm coming from. She was MBA type, again, with telecommunication, but I got along notoriously well with her. Sharon was the whistleblower on the whole Enron process. She is the one who actually went in and revealed what was going on. Don't know whether I had left by that time, so I had no idea whether it had anything to do with me or not, but she was very upstanding, and she's the one. But I don't believe Ken Lay had total grasp of what was going on. And I believe, and I have talked to attorneys who defended the Enron, a good friend of mine, Scott Yeager, who brought me in. Kind of a side note here, the government isn't always ethical either, by the way. Scott Yeager had sold companies and done very well. He started charities for the underprivileged. He would go to corporations, he'd get their computers, he'd restore them, take them out, and he would try to bridge the information gap and the educational gap. And he was doing this. He had nothing to do with anything. They went after him. And to get to him, they went after people who worked. I didn't work for him. He was in operations. They went to people, another friend of mine, John Griebling, and said, John, we're going to drag you through the coals unless you turn state's evidence on Scott. And if you don't, we're going to take you and put you in prison. And if the least you're going to do is you're going to end up, losing everything you own. Scott ended up spending $20 million to defend himself. And he actually ended up being the only one who didn't plead guilty, didn't have a problem. Still, he was not found guilty. But that's on like a side note as to sometimes the government doesn't play ethically either. So getting to the point, to wrap it up, is Ken, like I said, I don't think Ken had a full understanding. I think he knew, I think he was guilty, but like I said, I talked to attorneys that were defending him, and they had the same kind of opinion I did, that he probably didn't have his finger on the pulse well enough. So that was a problem. What ended up happening is he found out what was going on and where they stood and what was happening. And he had two choices. And these choices, by the way, I'm putting to you, what would you do? I've given you the background that if you don't hit your mark or exceed your projection from revenue, your stock is going to tumble. So he had, and so the company is potentially going to go out of business. He found out what were his choices. He could go to the Fed, the government. He could go to the stockholder and say, look, we found out that Jeff Skilling has been offloading bad debt onto to books that are on a company. We found out that we were doing mark to market that was way out of line. As a matter of fact, Fastow later said, I'll take my prison sentence, and by the way, mark to market accounting is like crack. Don't do it. So this was the CFO. So anyway, I think that what I'm coming from is I think that Ken Lay knew it, but he had one choice. He said, I've got to try to bail this company out. I've got to try to reverse what was going on, and I've got to get rid of these companies. I've got to figure out how to overcome the mark-to-market deficit that we've come into, and I'm going to try to save the company. Well, Sharon Watkins basically blew the whistle, and he ended up going to prison and dying in prison of a heart attack. Jeff Skilling is still in prison and is looking like he might get out 10 years later, 10 years from now, or even longer than earlier, but that's still 2028. But from an ethical perspective, I'll go back to the beginning when I talked about Snowden. Did Ken Lay do what was right? Ethically, he did not go to the stockholders. I mean, legally, he did not. He did not reveal the fact that the company was having a problem. But on the other hand, he was trying to save the stockholders and the company. So was he doing ethically? Was that the right thing to do, or was that still the wrong thing to do? That's a decision that I think everybody, and the type of thing that everybody, all of you, will face. You're going to need to come to grips with what is the right thing to do. If it's the right thing in your own mind, maybe, but probably not necessarily the right thing for the company and for the business. He should have gone to the stockholders, and he should have said, look, we messed up. They would still be in business. So any questions?
Now, Lay is the guy that was the one that was asking about the quarter, right? So
yes, on the
really, it was unethical for him not to even be involved.
Yes,
just letting him.
Yes,
put it up
running the company. You are absolutely right. Running the company, not to have the pulse of a multi-billion-dollar company that was on the rise. And by the way, that the mark to market caused their value of their company to skyrocket, way beyond, I don't know, it was like a 60-to-1 type of, it was unbelievable.
And that's all, pointless money that you don't even see.
You don't even see, and that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But yes, and I thought, and that's a great question, because that's exactly what I thought. I said, how can this guy be running this company and he not know? I mean, that's just negligent. Mm-hmm. So that ethically was, but there's a fine line between what's ethical and what's legal, and kind of like If it's legal, is it ethical? If it's ethical, is it legal? I mean, you could take a look at this from a different perspective, and you could kind of question that. I don't know your class is cyber ethics. I don't know how much you get into this, but this is a heck of this right now. I think you are in a position to, well, you've got a lot of material to work with. That's what I would say. And it sounds to me like an extremely interesting class. But that's the summary of Enron and how I see actually what's going on now with the decisions that needed to be made then and why the decisions were made. Greed, fear, maybe just arrogance. But I think this can lay it out of fear. Most of the companies, including Bernie Evers, was doing it because he was fearful that stock would drop so rapidly that the company would go out of business. And so a lot of unethical things happened to jack up the price of the companies in a time when it was almost impossible to do it any other way than to basically do poor accounting. Any questions? Or, I mean, I don't know, I'm open to questions, or I can get into other aspects of.
Yeah, to piggyback your comment, I was talking to him. I've heard the story a few times, and in a good way. And basically, they changed all the laws after this,
right,
for Sarbanes-Oxley. All the accounting principles changed.
Yep.
So when you are the CEO or the CFO of a large corporation, or even any corporation, you have to sign the accounting books. And when you sign them, claiming that you didn't know doesn't count anymore. You go to jail. So I believe it's the same in the cyber world. I'm not involved in that in any way like you guys are. But the more responsibility that you get with any type of business, you're taking on an inherent risk and responsibility. And the more money you make, the more accountable you are. So, that's what's interesting is whenever I hear the story about Mr. Lay not knowing, well, come on, you were in charge of a $100 billion company. So, in my mind, that's negligence in itself.
Sure it is. Yeah, absolutely, I agree with you. I agree. Any other questions?
Ethics is just a lot of gray area.
There's a lot of gray area.
Gray area.
But I mean, it is kind of the quote at one of the papers that it says, by the fall of 2000, Enron was starting to crumble under its own weight. CEO Jeff Skilling had a way of hiding the financial losses of the trading business and other operations of the company. It was called mark-to-market accounting. This is a technique used when trading securities, where you measure the value of the security based on its current market value instead of book value. This can work well for securities, but it can be disastrous for other businesses. So that's the decisions and the things that they were doing.
Is that practice still used? They still do that?
They do, but not nearly what they were doing. It was used to inflate the revenue bottom line, and that kind of, like, Arthur Andersen was put out of business. I mean, they came in and the guys from Arthur Andersen, they were smart guys, but they didn't know the telecommunication world either, and they were probably, Enron was their largest account. So what did they do? They were pretty much saying it's legal to do mark to market, but they didn't question them on how aggressively they were doing mark to market, or they didn't question them on, have you thought about the future and what happens if the bottom drops out? They're out of business.
And plan B.
There was no plan B, but they kept signing off on their books. Okay.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Did that cover what you wanted?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, it did. Fantastic. Thank you very much. We have no other questions, guys. Come on, I know this.
It's all right. Go ahead.
I don't know if this is off topic or not, but hiding the companies off book, how does that work? And I was wondering, just curious, how does that work? Hiding the companies that you own off book?
Well, this situation was he created basically some shell companies that were out there, And they weren't basically under the Enron banner at all. They were out there on their own. And he would sell distressed assets to them. And those distressed assets would then become income for Enron, the major company, the main company. But the distressed assets for that small company they basically remained with that company, but it wasn't on the books because he created this company, so it wasn't, nobody saw it, so there was no tie to them. So those companies were floundering, but he was still counting the revenue that he was the poor revenue, offloading the books and the deficits to these companies, and so he was making Enron, the main Enron company, look good. And while these companies were they were Chapter 11 type companies, but they weren't tied.
They weren't tied to anything. Okay.
Yeah.
You see, I know Enron was on the Forbes list for 6 years in a row as the top company, and it was all false.
It was all false. It was all false, and I'm telling you that culture. The review process was a joke. I mean, it was like, are you kidding me? It was like, come on, you guys. I mean, and so that kind of was the culture within the company, and the people were applauding that. And I got there, and I said I lasted a little more than a year. I'm not moving down there. So
another question: what about the lower level people, just the normal workers? Was there any talk amongst them about what was going on, or were they blind to it? Did they not know anything?
That's a great question, because they were drinking the Kool-Aid. They had an attitude.
They were just getting paid well.
They got paid very well, and they had their name on the stadium, the baseball stadium. And, I think it's now Minute Maid, but it used to be the Enron Bowl and the Enron Stadium. But the people that are here, man, a lot of them they were bowing down to Skillian, and these guys are fantastic. They were all the NBA types, and the idea of online trading, they had created trading floors that were as big as this whole building, the top floor, one building, with trading desks. They were trading the gas, and they were trading the power, and they did pretty well with that to some degree. But they thought they could trade the bandwidth, and I was going to kind of point it, didn't quite make, but it's very difficult to trade bandwidth. And the idea is that you needed X amount of fiber or X amount of bandwidth for a big event that you're having. So we're going to pay you to, and what we'll do is we'll turn that bandwidth up for it. You're going to pay us 5 times what we would have made for it originally. But
it was like the original cloud computing.
Exactly. That's exactly where I was going. So what ended up happening, the problem with bandwidth not only became that I worked for a Metropolitan Fiber where we actually installed fiber, where at the time, dark fiber was, that was the sacred cow. That was gold. And then all of a sudden they started lighting it and multi-division multiplexing it, and there became more and more of it. But you still had a distance problem. And so one of the things that happened is, in the latency, by the way, especially in the trading environment, became an issue, even with the speed of light. But when cloud computing came along, what ended up happening is you could expand and contract right there in the building that I was talking about before. So the latency what overcame the issues of what we were talking about with clouds as opposed to fiber.
Can you talk about the 401ks real quick, and the people having to buy the stock?
Well, that was kind of interesting, both at WorldCom and at Enron. At WorldCom, when I left WorldCom, Bernie Evers, basically he looked at who was bought and sold every day. He knew. Actually, I was asked by his direct report if I wouldn't put in mind, because he wanted to leave before me, but he knew exactly the day I left, and he made the comment that we're starting to get in trouble because some of our top guys are leaving. But Enron, they made you buy the stock for your 401k. Made you. That is what you had to buy. If you didn't, you basically would lose your job. But look what they did. They went and through bad ethics and illegal methods, they caused, like Tommy was inferring, thousands of people to lose their retirement. Talk about unethical. Whew. So, like I said, it was an interesting experience, and I learned a lot. But that company, I don't have anything really good to say about them. But anyway,
we didn't think you did.
So,
I have a question. Do you still keep up with the business? I was wondering if there are any companies that you do have something to say about.
well, the telecommunication, telecommunications evolve so rapidly. Yeah, what companies?
Any kind of like
Are there- Are there any companies that survived that worked hand in hand with them that survived?
Yeah, I worked for.
Sprint's still here.
I worked for Sprint. I ran when we merged with them, I ran a data organization for Telenet and was brought underneath a company that thought that voice was the only thing that there was. And I started a division that was and pushed hard to do it, to start a data division that would go in and basically walk in with the voice guys who they thought ruled the world, and they made it. But Sprint, they made it, and there are some internet companies, that have one company that's having trouble right now. When I was back with a company, it was just before Telenet, and my organization signed the first communication contract with AOL. But we were talking about baud, 1200 baud and 300 baud, which is not anywhere near what we're talking about now, megabytes per second versus 1,000 per second. But AOL, they were a company that was back then.
AOL's still making money.
AOL still making
Like
money.
a lot. It's very surprising.
They all pretty much straightened up. I'd say so the ones that survived, they did so because they were playing by the rules. And
this is what not to do.
Exactly.
yeah, this is what not to do. And there were a lot of people were throwing a lot of money at the .coms, and everybody thought, well, I can get the .com going, and there's a lot of people who obviously lost their money. But what I see more now is creative technology companies that are starting up, and everybody still thinks that they're going to make it. As Tommy knows, he's been in the business side of this, and he's seen a lot of companies that think they're going to make millions, and you say, oh, billions, and some make it. But I want to be a professional baseball player too, and some of us do, but not very many of us. So but from your perspective, a lot has gone on since the time, mergers, acquisitions, et cetera, et cetera. WorldCom, MCI, they're gone. Sprint survived. Like I said, and there's some other startups. Metropolitan Fiber got absorbed by a company called Level 3. They were a good company. They're still existing. They're more of a business type of an operation, telecommunication company. IBM, but IBM, I have friends at high places in IBM too. And let me tell you something. Those guys, it used to be they wanted to know what kind of sales you made and how the sales are going. So I was the one who said that. They always go, okay, Steve, what are your sales projections? Not maybe as aggressive as they are now. Now, the friends I had are on the accounting side. They are daily asked, how come they're not making the numbers, or are they making the numbers? IBM in particular is beating people up in the accounting side. So now, to me, that may set you up for kind of some ethical issues, because there's only so many things you can do in accounting. So what happens? You can't, and so, and the competition and what happened with the IBM, they are still solid, but they had the market, but they got arrogant, and companies came along, and they did not at the time believe in laptops, and I know, and it's like, We're not doing laptops. You know, it's a mainframe world, and obviously that got them. That arrogance got them because they're doing okay, but they're nowhere near what they could have done.
I have a question for you. So, with the understanding that mark-to-market and speculation is kind of the nature of the beast in the business world and was at the time, was there any point, assuming along the lines of the narrative, that the actions taken were preconceived? They didn't intend for this to happen. Was there a point where they could have saved the company, avoided losses for the stockholders, and saved themselves prison time?
That's a great question from the perspective that I actually wanted to make that, because from a telecommunications side, there was not a preconceived notion to defraud or to in any way kind of jack up the price of the stock by using mark to market. They were more fearful of the stock going down, and so they used mark to market. But it wasn't in a, I would say, basically an illegal mode. Could they have turned around and said we shouldn't be doing this? They couldn't, because they didn't think that way. They could have, but the question is excellent, because nobody ever foresaw what was going to go on. As a matter of fact, one of the companies that I was helping negotiate with was Blockbuster, and Blockbuster, they were arrogant, and so you had these two parties together, and we're going to charge X number of cents for each streaming video that went down, and Blockbuster was trying to get it higher, and we were trying to get it lower, and I'm going, well, why are we hold the cards. I said, why are you negotiating down and afraid of them? Well, they could do this, that, and the other. Well, the problem is that Blockbuster didn't have the rights to all the filming studios. Those were held back, and they were all starting to come due. So what ended up happening is they lost the ability to take the movies, the first released movies, and at that point you would have thought, whoa, what are we doing here? I mean, because we don't have any content. We have adult content, and that's about it. But the Blockbuster, as you see, they went out of business. But that was a period of time I think they probably should have said, well, wait a minute, not necessarily from a mark to market. Maybe they could have built a backbone and not traded it, but they could have probably said, well, this is maybe moving in a direction that we probably didn't quite anticipate. But they wouldn't do that. They just thought that they couldn't fail. And that's what they used to say time and time again. We're not going to fail, we're Enron. We're not going to fail, we're Enron. So they didn't have that mentality to sit back and evaluate where they're going. They knew they were going to succeed because they're Enron. And that was one of the things that caused them to, because they didn't sit back, as every company should, and look at, are we on target?
I'd like to take something he just said and point out something that basically what he stated is that there doesn't necessarily need to be a level of malfeasance in order for your actions to be unethical. So from a cyber perspective, we were talking about self-driving cars and all the unintended repercussions that can result in pushing this technology faster than it should come out. We kind of have the same situation. We don't know what's going to come of it. These executives at Google that are developing this technology, should they take actions ahead of where the technology actually is and puts cars out on the road that end up killing people? Somebody's going to have to take the blame. Somebody's going to have to be responsible for that. So these are the things that you have to look at, because while you might not have any malfeasance or have ill intent,
right,
you have to look at the actions or the outcome as a whole and what could happen. And this is especially true in the cyber world, where the technology is streaming out there. It can kill people. It affects global economies. There's a lot of things tied into that. So it's interesting if you take this business perspective and you wrap it into our cyber perspective. start to see some of the connections here and some of the things that you guys are going to have to think of moving forward.
Great point, because it's a complicated situation, and the type of course that you're teaching, I think, helps people kind of wade through that. Because it's, to me right now, cyber ethics is huge. It may be the most significant and most relevant issue out there right now, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I'm just watching what's going on with the breaching of the surveys and the hacking of the surveys, and supposedly the Russians coming in, and well, of course they're not going to go by ethics, but there are ethics that, but there are ethics that, I mean, that's not a political statement outside of the fact that I think it's true. But there are so many things now that could cause a company to, I mean, there's companies that are making a lot of money based on hacking personal servers.
That's the global idea of ethics. So in China, this is completely acceptable. In Russia, it's completely acceptable. State-sponsored hacking and state-sponsored activism is acceptable. From their perspective, it is ethically acceptable to take those actions. We're on the other end. Clearly, we don't agree, but we're the affected party. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting, this world we live in, wrapping all this together. And
similar to the Enron thing, that's where I think AI is going to end up. I think we're going to get ahead of ourselves with artificial intelligence. Yeah. We're going to regret it in the end.
Yeah. There's a lot going on. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the time.
I appreciate you coming.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.